Every few years, America goes to war in the Middle East, and every time, the same questions get asked. Why are we there? What are we fighting for? When does it end? The official answers change constantly. Weapons of mass destruction, democracy promotion, counter-terrorism, Al-Qaeda, the Hamas. The justifications shift. The war stays. And here's the question nobody in Washington wants to answer directly. What if the instability isn't the problem America is trying to solve? What if the instability is the product America is trying to protect? What if a stable, unified, sovereign Middle East is the one outcome the United States has spent 80 years and trillions of dollars working to prevent? Not because American policymakers are evil, not because there's a secret room where men in suits plan the next war, but because the architecture of American global power requires a Middle East that is permanently divided, perpetually dependent, and structurally incapable of acting as a unified bloc. The evidence isn't hidden. It's in the declassified documents, the Senate hearings, the arms sales figures, the pipeline maps. It's in the pattern, the 80-year pattern of American behavior that makes no sense if you assume America wants stability, and perfect sense if you assume it doesn't. This is the story of why the United States needs the Middle East broken, how that strategy was built, what it costs, and why the war you're watching right now between the US, Israel, and Iran is not a new conflict. It's the same system, reaching its logical conclusion. Let's start at the beginning. In 1945, the world was being rebuilt from rubble. Europe was devastated. Japan was destroyed. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people. Britain, technically a victor, was bankrupt. And America emerged from the Second World War as something history had never quite seen before. The only major industrial economy that hadn't been bombed. The largest creditor nation on Earth. The sole possessor of nuclear weapons. The dominant naval power in every ocean simultaneously. But power of that scale needs fuel. Literally, the American military machine ran on oil. The American industrial economy ran on oil. The American consumer society being built in the post-war years, it all ran on oil. And in 1945, American military planners were staring at maps and seeing something that would define the next century of foreign policy. The Middle East sat on roughly 60% of the world's proven oil reserves. Not 10%, not 20%. 60%. Whoever controlled access to that oil controlled the industrial output of every nation on Earth. Controlled Europe's reconstruction, controlled Japan's recovery, controlled the pace at which any challenger, specifically the Soviet Union, could build its economy and military. This was the prize. And American strategists understood it with absolute clarity. In February 1945, President Roosevelt met King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud aboard the USS Quincy in the Suez Canal. The meeting lasted 5 hours. The formal agreement was never published, but the substance is documented in subsequent State Department cables. America would guarantee Saudi security. Saudi Arabia would guarantee American access oil, flowing, priced in dollars, American companies' primary, security for oil, military protection for market access. But here's what that deal required that nobody discusses. For the transaction to hold, Saudi Arabia needed an enemy, a threat, a reason to need American protection. A Saudi Arabia, at peace with its neighbors, integrated into a stable regional order, didn't need an American military umbrella. A confident, unified Arab world could negotiate its own terms. It could price oil in whatever currency it chose. The value of the American security guarantee depended entirely on Saudi Arabia feeling insecure. This wasn't an accident. It was the architecture. To understand why America cannot allow a stable Middle East, you need to understand what the dollar actually is. In 1971, Nixon ended the gold standard. The dollar was no longer convertible to gold. It was backed by nothing except a deal made with Saudi Arabia 2 years later. In 1973, following the Arab oil embargo, the Nixon administration negotiated a secret agreement. America would provide weapons and security guarantees. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would do two things: price all oil in US dollars and invest its surplus revenues in US Treasury bonds. Every country that wanted to buy oil, Japan, Germany, France, India, China, had to first acquire dollars. The entire global economy reorganized around the dollar's role as the currency of oil. This is the petrodollar system, and it is the foundation of American financial power. The U.S. could print dollars to pay its debts, because there was always global demand for dollars. It could run permanent trade deficits, because countries needed to hold dollars to buy oil. It could borrow at low interest rates, because the world's central banks needed dollar-denominated assets. The petrodollar system gave America a permanent tax on the entire global economy. Every oil transaction, everywhere in the world, generated demand for dollars. America collected the benefit, but here is the critical vulnerability that American planners have been managing ever since. The petrodollar system only works as long as oil is priced in dollars, and oil is only priced in dollars as long as the countries that produce it need American protection, and they only need American protection as long as the region remains dangerous enough to require it. A stable, sovereign Middle East, one that didn't need American security guarantees, could price oil in euros or yuan, or a new Gulf currency. Several have tried. The consequences have been instructive. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced Iraq would price its oil in euros. Within 3 years, Iraq was invaded, Saddam was deposed, and oil pricing returned $2. In 2009, Muammar Gaddafi proposed a Pan-African gold dinar to price oil and commodities. Within 2 years, Gaddafi was dead, Libya was destroyed, and the gold dinar never materialized. In 2023, Saudi Arabia publicly discussed accepting yuan for Chinese oil purchases. Washington's reaction was immediate diplomatic pressure, intelligence warnings, urgent meetings about the threat to dollar reserve status. The pattern is not subtle. Challenge dollar oil pricing, and the United States will find a reason to remove you, destabilize you, or apply sufficient pressure to reverse the decision. This is not conspiracy. This is the logical behavior of a power whose financial dominance depends on maintaining a specific pricing mechanism for a specific commodity. Understanding this single mechanism explains more about American Middle East policy than any other factor. In fiscal year 2023, the United States approved $238 billion worth of weapons sales to foreign governments. A significant share went to the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is consistently the world's largest arms importer. The UAE is in the top 5. Israel receives $3.8 billion in direct military aid annually. Egypt receives $1.3 billion. Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain all receive substantial packages every year. This isn't charity, it is an industry. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing Defense, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, these companies generate enormous portions of their revenue from Middle Eastern governments. Raytheon's Patriot missile systems are deployed across the Gulf. Lockheed's F-35 depends heavily on foreign military sales. Boeing sells F-15s to Saudi Arabia and Qatar. American defense companies employ roughly 3.5 million people directly and support millions more in supply chains across almost every American state. These companies contribute tens of millions in campaign donations to congressional representatives who approve the weapons sales. Those weapons flow to a region whose conflicts justify the next round of purchases. Here's the structural trap nobody discusses plainly. American presidents don't sell weapons to the Middle East despite regional instability. They sell weapons because of regional instability. A peaceful, demilitarized Gulf has no need for $50 billion worth of American fighter jets, missile defense systems, and precision munitions every decade. The threat environment, Iran's missile program, Houthi drones, regional rivalries, the residual threat of ISIS, justifies the purchases, and the purchases depend on the threat environment remaining credible. This is not Eisenhower's military-industrial complex's metaphor. It is Eisenhower's military-industrial complex's operating mechanism, and the Middle East is its primary market. A stable Middle East would represent one of the largest market contractions in the history of American industry. The arms economy needs the region to keep burning, not as a conspiracy, as a business model. If you're starting to see the pattern, if the system is beginning to make sense in a way it never did when it was explained as a series of mistakes, subscribe now, because what comes next is the centerpiece. The story of Iran, Israel, and why the war you're watching today was engineered decades before the first missile was fired. No country is more central to the architecture of American Middle East strategy than Iran, and no relationship is more deliberately misunderstood. The official narrative is simple. Iran is a revolutionary theocracy that wants to destroy Israel, dominate the Gulf, and export terrorism. America opposes Iran because Iran is dangerous? Simple. The history is considerably more revealing. In 1953, Iran had a democratically elected prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh. He had done something that seemed reasonable from an Iranian perspective and catastrophic from an Anglo-American one. He nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the company that would become BP, arguing that Iranian oil should belong to Iranians. The British imposed an embargo, and in August 1953, the CIA and British intelligence organized a coup, Operation Ajax. They paid street gangs to riot, bribed military officers, and removed Mossadegh from power. The Shah was restored, with American backing and significantly expanded authoritarian control. The nationalized oil company returned to foreign ownership, now split between British and American companies. For 26 years, the Shah ruled as an authoritarian ally of the United States. SAVAK, his secret police, tortured and imprisoned political opponents. The wealth from oil flowed to a narrow elite and to American-aligned interests. The population seethed. In 1979, they rose. The Islamic Revolution swept the Shah from power, and the United States discovered what happens when you suppress a population's legitimate political aspirations for a generation. You get the most radical available alternative. The Iranian revolutionaries who took power hated America, not because of American values. They hated America because America had destroyed their democracy in 1953 and replaced it with 26 years of brutal authoritarian rule. This is not Iranian propaganda. The CIA officially acknowledged the coup in 2013. It is confirmed, documented history. Now here's what happened next, and this is the part that explains everything. After the Islamic Revolution, Iran escaped the American security architecture. It was no longer dependent on American weapons, training, or diplomatic protection. A country of 85 million people, sitting on the fourth largest proven oil reserves on Earth, was operating outside the system. The response was immediate. In 1980, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran, beginning an 8-tier war that would kill roughly 1 million people. The Reagan administration provided Iraq with intelligence, economic credits, and one of the most documented and least discussed chapters of American foreign policy, the chemical weapons, precursors that Saddam used to gas Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians. American policy was not to support Iraq. It was to ensure neither side won, to bleed both countries, to keep both exhausted, both incapable of projecting power regionally. When Iraq began winning too decisively, the U.S. tilted toward Iran. When Iran began winning too decisively, the U.S. tilted back toward Iraq. The goal was permanent, managed attrition. After the war, both countries were economically devastated. The Gulf states, which had financed Iraq, were beholden to American protection, and the region was divided along lines that required American mediation for the next generation. This is the Iran template, not containment, not regime change as an end in itself. Permanent isolation, a state large enough to threaten its neighbors, but pressured enough that it cannot achieve the economic and military capacity to become a genuine regional power operating on its own terms. The sanctions are not designed to change Iranian behavior. They are designed to prevent Iranian capacity. There is a difference. Changing behavior requires offering incentives for different choices. Preventing capacity requires permanent pressure regardless of choices made. When Iran agreed to the JCPOA nuclear deal in 2015, curtailing its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief, international inspectors confirmed it was complying. The Trump administration withdrew from the deal in 2018 and reimposed maximum pressure sanctions not because Iran had violated the agreement, but because it contained economically recovering Iran moving toward regional integration was precisely what the architecture could not allow. The nuclear program is the justification. The real issue is the trajectory. The American-Israeli relationship is framed in terms of shared values, cultural affinity, and moral obligations rooted in the Holocaust. All of these are real, but the strategic logic is equally important and far less discussed. Israel is the only country in the Middle East that America doesn't need to persuade, bribe, or pressure into supporting American military objectives. It is the most militarily capable state in the region, most advanced air force, most sophisticated intelligence services, and an undeclared but universally understood nuclear arsenal. In strategic terms, Israel is a forward intelligence platform across the Levant, and a de facto American military partner capable of independent action that American forces sometimes cannot politically undertake directly. The $3.8 billion in annual military aid is not charity, it is payment for strategic services. It ensures Israeli military superiority over every state in the region, which serves multiple American interests simultaneously. Israeli dominance prevents any regional coalition from achieving the military parity that would allow it to challenge American presence through force. It guarantees that no regional power can enforce oil pricing on its own terms. But here is the dynamic that drives the current war, and that has been building for decades. Iran and Israel are not natural enemies. They have no border dispute. They have no territorial conflict. Before 1979, under the Shah, Iran and Israel had functional diplomatic relations. Israeli tourists visited Tehran. Iranian oil flowed to Israeli refineries. What made them enemies is not geography or religion or ancient hatred. What made them enemies is that they represent two incompatible solutions to the question of who organizes the Middle East. An Israeli-American axis that maintains regional military dominance, keeps Arab states divided, preserves dollar oil pricing, and prevents any independent power center from emerging. Or an Iranian-led resistance axis, however flawed, however brutal in its own right, that represents the proposition that the region should be organized by its own states, on their own terms, outside American financial and military architecture. This is why Iran funds Hezbollah in Lebanon, why it funded Hamas in Gaza, why it backs the Houthis in Yemen, why it maintains militias in Iraq and Syria. Not because Tehran is coordinating a master plan for Islamic domination, but because each of these groups represents a pressure point against the American-Israeli architecture that has strangled Iranian economic and political development for 40 years. And this is why Israel has spent 2 decades arguing that Iran must be permanently prevented from acquiring nuclear weapons. Not because a nuclear Iran would immediately use them, but because a nuclear-armed Iran is Iran that America cannot attack. A deterred Iran is Iran that survives indefinitely outside the system. And Iran that survives indefinitely outside the system is a permanent proof of concept that it is possible to refuse the architecture and live. that cannot be allowed, not by Washington, not by the Gulf monarchies who built their security on the American guarantee, not by Israel, whose regional military supremacy depends on no other state achieving strategic deterrence. The Gaza war that began in October 2023 accelerated the timeline. The scale of the destruction, the images, the death toll. The months of siege broke the narrative management that had always been part of maintaining American regional legitimacy. Arab populations who had tolerated American-aligned governments for decades reached a threshold. The Gulf monarchies found themselves facing a choice between their American security relationship and their domestic political survival. Iran saw both an opportunity and an obligation. Its proxy architecture, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, activated. The pressure on Israel intensified from multiple directions simultaneously. Israel struck Iranian territory directly. Iran struck Israeli territory directly. The exchanges that had operated through proxies for 20 years became direct, and the United States, rather than restraining its ally, provided the missile defense systems, the intelligence sharing, and the diplomatic cover that enabled escalation. Because from Washington's strategic perspective, this was not a crisis to be managed. It was an outcome to be achieved. The permanent degradation of Iranian military capacity, the destruction of the proxy architecture that Iran had spent 40 years building, the reassertion of the American-Israeli military dominance that guarantees the petrodollar system and the arms market. The war between the U.S., Israel, and Iran is not a new conflict born of recent provocation. It is the conclusion of a strategy that has been executing since 1953, 70 years of sanctions, coups, proxy wars, and managed pressure, finally arriving at the direct confrontation that all of it was designed to produce or prevent Iran from surviving. Whether it was inevitable is the wrong question. The right question is who built the road that led here. Since 2001, the United States has spent approximately $8 trillion on post-9/11 wars and military operations across the Middle East and Central Asia. That figure comes from Brown University's Costs of War project. $8 trillion. More than the combined GDP of Germany and France, more than 4 times the cost of the entire Second World War, adjusted for inflation. It produced the destruction of Iraq as a functioning state, the permanent destabilization of Libya, the longest war in American history in Afghanistan, ending with the Taliban back in power where they were in 2001, the creation of ISIS, which emerged directly from the power vacuum of the Iraq invasion, the displacement of over 37 million people. By any conventional measure of return on investment, this is catastrophic. Unless you measure by a different metric, the $8 trillion didn't disappear. Money doesn't disappear, it transferred. Lockheed Martin, whose stock increased over 1,000% between 2001 and 2021, to Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing Defense, 2 private military contractors who billed the government billions for services in Iraq alone, 2 oil companies that gained access to Iraqi reserves following the invasion. The $8 trillion is not the cost of failed policy, it is the revenue of successful policy, depending entirely on whose success you're measuring. The American soldiers who died -7,000 in Iraq and Afghanistan did not die for nothing in the human sense. They died serving a country they believed in. But in the structural sense, their sacrifice underwrote a transfer of American public wealth to American private defense and energy interests on a scale that has no historical parallel. And the populations of the Middle East who died 900,000 by conservative estimates absorbed the cost that made the system run. This is what bearing the burden of global leadership means, translated from diplomatic language into arithmetic. The 2020s are different from the decades that preceded them in one specific way. For 50 years, the strategy of managed instability produced manageable costs. Wars were geographically contained. Oil stayed priced in dollars. Regional challengers were small enough to be handled through proxy, conflict, or sanctions. The American public accepted the cost because the threats were made to seem existential. None of those conditions fully hold anymore. China's Belt and Road Initiative has invested hundreds of billions in Middle Eastern infrastructure. China is now the largest trading partner for most Gulf states and the largest purchaser of Saudi, Iraqi, and Iranian oil. It is offering something America never offered: investment without political conditions, without democracy requirements, without military presence. China is building economic dependence across the Middle East, without a single base, and without a single war. In 2023, China brokered a diplomatic normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the 2 pillars of the regional Cold War that American strategy had sustained for 40 years. The Gulf states were choosing their own path, not because they loved China, because the American architecture was becoming more costly than it was worth. The petrodollar system is under its most serious challenge since 1973. Saudi Arabia is actively diversifying its currency relationships. China is building institutional infrastructure for yuan-denominated oil settlement. The dollar's share of global reserves has declined from 71% in 2002, roughly 58% today. The direction is clear, even if the pace is uncertain. The proxy architecture is collapsing under its own weight. The Houthi campaign in the Red Sea, using Iranian-supplied missiles and drones to disrupt global shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb, demonstrated that chaos America helped create in Yemen came back as a direct threat to global trade. The United States launched Operation Prosperity Guardian to stop the missiles. The strikes didn't stop the missiles. They demonstrated that America could bomb Yemen indefinitely without solving a problem that American weapons helped create in the first place, and the Gaza war broke the narrative. Images shared instantly across social media, at a scale impossible to manage through traditional diplomatic channels, ended the story that American presence in the Middle East was about protection and stability. Arab populations whose governments had been American-aligned for decades reached a threshold of visible, unmistakable anger. The domestic pressure on Gulf monarchies to distance themselves from Washington became existential. The architecture is not collapsing, but it is being renegotiated under pressure for the first time since the petrodollar agreement in 1973. And here is the danger in that. Systems built on managed instability don't transition peacefully to stability. When the pressure valves begin to fail, when the tools of management start producing unmanageable outcomes, the defenders of the system don't reform it, they escalate. They reach for bigger tools. They double down on the methods that are no longer working because those methods are all they have. The direct USS-Iran confrontation that is unfolding now is not a sign that the system is working. It is a sign that the system has reached the boundary of what managed instability can contain. A pressure cooker that has been building for 70 years has lost its release valves. The pressure is now the war itself. Conclusion. Seeing what was always there in 1953, the CIA removed Iran's democratic government to protect an oil company. In 1973, America turned an oil embargo into the petrodollar system that made the dollar irreplaceable. In the 1980s, America managed a war between Iraq and Iran to ensure both remained too weak to challenge regional hierarchy. In 1991 and 2003, America destroyed Iraq's military capacity and then its state capacity, the one Arab country, large and resource-rich enough to anchor an independent regional order. In 2011, America and its allies destroyed Libya when its leader proposed pricing African commodities outside the dollar system. For 20 years, America sanctioned Iran to prevent not nuclear weapons specifically, but the economic recovery that would make Iran too powerful to isolate. For 75 years, America funded Israeli military supremacy to ensure that no regional power could enforce its own terms through force. Each decision was justified on its own terms. Stopping communism, protecting allies, preventing WMDs, fighting terrorism, countering Iranian aggression. Each justification was real enough to be believed by the people making the decision, real enough to sell to a domestic audience. But the pattern across 80 years, across every administration, across every stated rationale, is consistent. Actions that produce stability, sovereignty, and regional integration are not taken, or are actively reversed. Actions that produce fragmentation, dependence, and conflict are taken repeatedly. This is not accident, it is architecture. And architecture, as we've seen with Rockefeller, as we've seen with the debt system, doesn't require anyone to be evil. It just requires institutions to follow their structural incentives. The defense company follows profit, the treasury follows dollar dominance. The military follows its institutional interest in maintaining bases and relevance. The political class follows the campaign contributions and the polling on security threats. Nobody has to plan the instability. They just have to keep making individually rational decisions within a system whose overall logic produces it. The war unfolding today between the United States, Israel, and Iran was not started by the people currently fighting it. It was built by the people who designed the architecture 70 years ago. The current participants are running a program that was written before most of them were born. Understanding this does not make the war less real. The missiles are real, the dead are real, the suffering is real. But it changes what you believe when the next justification is offered, the next existential threat, the next weapons program that must be destroyed before it destroys us, the next government that must be changed for the sake of regional stability. The Middle East is not unstable because its people are primitive, or its religions are violent, or its politics are irrational. It is unstable because instability there is. Structurally, the price of stability here. That is the system. It has been the system for 80 years. And now, for the first time, the system is fighting its final battle to survive, because the world it was built to manage no longer exists. Now you've seen it. If this changed how you see what's happening right now, if the war you're watching finally makes sense in a way the news never made it make sense, subscribe, because this is not the last system we're going to take apart. Every major conflict, every economic crisis, every geopolitical realignment of the next decade has an architecture beneath it. And once you learn to see the architecture, the news never looks the same again.